Some cases leave behind a weapon. Some leave behind a confession. This one left behind a roll of film. And that is where the case becomes strange, because the pictures on that film did not solve the crime in the way people might expect. They did something almost more dangerous. They created an image. A myth. A version of two fugitives that the public could stare at, argue about, romanticize, hate, and remember. Police thought they had found evidence. The newspapers found a legend. And once that legend got printed on the front page, it became harder and harder to separate the real Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow from the story America wanted to believe about them. That is the part worth slowing down for. Because when people talk about Bonnie and Clyde, they usually jump straight to the ambush, the bullet-riddled car, the outlaw couple dying together on a lonely road. But the deeper question is not just how they died. The deeper question is how two young criminals, both barely into adulthood, became symbols of love, rebellion, violence, poverty, freedom, and fear all at the same time. And if we follow the evidence carefully, the answer does not begin with the final gunfire. It begins much earlier, with stolen cars, a small bottle traced back to Texas, a prison farm that seems to have changed Clyde Barrow completely, and a camera the gang accidentally left behind when they ran for their lives. The roll of film. When investigators first started connecting the trail, they were not looking at a grand legend. They were looking at car thefts. That sounds small compared to everything that would come later, but stay with that detail, because the cars matter. Around September of 1932, federal investigators began noticing a pattern across several states. Cars were being stolen, used, abandoned, and replaced. The crimes were not staying neatly inside one county or one state. Whoever was doing this understood something very important about the time they were living in: crossing state lines could slow the law down. Local departments did not always share information quickly. Jurisdictions were fragmented. One police force might know one piece, another force might know a different piece, and by the time anybody compared notes, the fugitives were already gone. So at first, the pattern looked like a chain of car thefts. But inside one of those abandoned cars, police found something that did not belong there. A small medicine bottle. A kitchen medicine bottle, traced back to Texas. That kind of evidence is not dramatic. It does not look like the object that breaks a case open. But this is exactly why it matters. Because the bottle gave investigators a thread. And when they pulled that thread, it led them toward a group connected to the Barrow gang. Here is where the case starts to bend away from the stereotype. The center of the group was not an old mob boss sitting in a smoky room, or a hardened crime kingpin surrounded by bodyguards. The two figures who kept appearing at the center of the trail were young, small, and almost ordinary looking. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Both were in their early 20s. Bonnie was tiny, not even 5 feet tall, with strawberry blonde curls and bright eyes. Clyde was thin, quiet, and neat-looking, the kind of young man who could look almost polite if you caught him in the right suit, from the right angle. That contrast is important. Because on paper, the crimes were getting more violent. But in photographs, they did not look like monsters. They looked like a couple. And that gap, the gap between what they were accused of doing and how they appeared to the public, would become one of the strangest forces in the whole case. But before the newspapers had those famous images, before Bonnie posed with a cigar and a gun, before Clyde became the sharp-dressed outlaw in the public imagination, investigators were still trying to understand who they were. And to understand why this small medicine bottle mattered, why stolen cars kept appearing across state lines, why a gang like this could move so quickly, we have to pull the file backward. Not to turn their lives into an excuse. Not to soften what happened. But because Clyde Barrow especially seems to have crossed a line long before the final ambush. And the file suggests that one place in particular may have changed him: Eastham Prison Farm. Before the myth had a face. Bonnie Parker's early life does not look, at first glance, like the beginning of a criminal legend. She was born in Texas, in a small town called Rowena, on October 1, 1910. She was the second child in the family, with an older brother and a younger sister. Her father worked as a bricklayer, but he died when Bonnie was still very young. Her mother, Emma, moved the children to a poor section of Dallas and supported them by sewing. So yes, poverty was there from the start. But Bonnie was not described as someone who seemed destined for violence. She did well in school. She liked writing poetry. She liked photographs. She liked performing. There was something theatrical about her even before the crime story swallowed her. She seemed to imagine a future larger than the place she came from. But that future cracked early. At 15, Bonnie met Roy. He was handsome, reckless, and violent enough that the adults around her could see trouble coming. Bonnie did not see it that way. Or maybe she did, but she mistook danger for romance. At 16, she left school and married him. The marriage became a nightmare quickly. Roy kept committing crimes. He drank. He was abusive. Bonnie eventually fled back to her mother. But here is a detail that never quite leaves the story: she did not divorce him. She kept wearing the wedding ring. She even had his name tattooed on her right thigh. That is not proof of anything on its own. But it tells us something about Bonnie's pattern. When she attached herself to someone, she did not detach easily. Even when the relationship had already hurt her. Even when everyone around her could see it was dangerous. Clyde Barrow came from the same hard world. He was born on March 24, 1909, in Tellico, Texas, into a poor farming family. Around the 1920s, like many families who had lost land or opportunity, the Barrows moved toward Dallas and ended up in a poor, crowded, unstable neighborhood. Clyde was not physically imposing. He was around 5'7", thin, usually careful with his hair, and fond of cars and music. That part matters because cars were not just transportation for Clyde. Cars became his method. His escape route. His advantage. Later, his ability to drive fast, change vehicles, and read roads under pressure would save the gang again and again. But he was not building a clean life. Under the influence of his older brother Buck, Clyde began drifting into theft. At first, it was small. Then it grew. He stole cars. Broke into stores. Cracked safes. Robbed. Moved between odd jobs and crime until crime became the thing that stuck. By 1930, he was already familiar to police. And that is when he met Bonnie. Their first meeting has been told so many times that it is easy to forget the simple danger of it. Bonnie was 19. Clyde was already a young criminal. They connected quickly. The file frames both of them as restless romantics. She wrote poetry, he loved music, both seemed unwilling to settle into the ordinary life available to them. For Bonnie, who had already survived a failed marriage, Clyde may have looked like a second chance. But almost immediately, reality cut through the romance. Clyde was arrested on burglary and car theft charges and sentenced to 14 years. This is the first point where Bonnie's role becomes harder to ignore. She could have stepped back. She could have treated Clyde as another dangerous man who had entered her life. Instead, she kept visiting him. She traveled by bus to see him, despite her mother's objections. And then she did something that moves her from girlfriend to active participant in the file. She smuggled a gun into jail for him. Clyde used that gun to escape on March 11, 1930. But the escape lasted only a few days. He was caught again and sent to Eastham Prison Farm. And here, the story darkens. The prison farm. The file describes Eastham as a place that could break a person. Prisoners were beaten, starved, forced into brutal labor, and treated as if their lives had almost no value. Clyde saw prisoners punished savagely. He saw men abused. He saw guards with almost absolute control. One incident described in the file involves a prisoner being beaten and locked inside a hot metal cell until he died. Whether every detail in the surviving accounts can be measured perfectly is not the point for our purposes. What matters is that the file repeatedly presents Eastham as the place where Clyde changed. And there is one moment in particular that stands out. Clyde, under long-term abuse, finally snapped. He killed a man who had been abusing him, using an iron pipe. According to the file, another prisoner who was already serving a life sentence took responsibility, and the killing was buried. This was Clyde's first killing in the account. Not a bank robbery. not a shootout with police. A killing inside a prison farm that he already hated. But the strangest detail from Eastham is not even that. It is the toes. Clyde wanted to get out of the brutal farm labor so badly that he deliberately cut off 2 of his own toes. Think about what that means. A man chose permanent injury because the prison conditions felt worse than losing part of his own body. But here is the cruel turn: just before he did it, without Clyde knowing, his mother had already succeeded in getting him parole. If he had waited only a little longer, he could have walked out whole. Instead, when he was released on February 2, 1932, he limped out changed, physically and psychologically. His sister would later say that something terrible must have happened to him inside, because he was not the same person when he came home. Another prisoner described it even more sharply: he had watched Clyde turn from a boy into a snake. This is not an excuse. It is a fracture line. Because from this point forward, Clyde's criminal life stops looking like aimless theft and begins to look like a mission shaped by rage. According to the file, he came out of Eastham with a hatred of the prison system and a specific revenge fantasy: attack the prison, kill guards, free inmates. That obsession matters because it will return later, in one of the biggest turning points of the whole case. A prison farm that helped create Clyde Barrow would eventually become the target of Clyde Barrow. But for the moment, he went looking for Bonnie. She was still there. And that may be the most dangerous fact in the early story. Their bond had not weakened during separation. It had hardened. Bonnie knew the path ahead was unlikely to end well. The file makes that clear. But she chose to stay close. Clyde began gathering old friends and criminal contacts. The early Barrow gang formed around him. One of the core figures was Raymond, a volatile man with a criminal history of his own. The plan at first was not glamorous. Rob stores. Rob gas stations. Gather money. Gather weapons. Build toward the bigger goal, Eastham. Bonnie's role, at least according to the file, was not the same as the men's role. The men handled most of the gunfire. Bonnie helped with logistics, loading, cover, and support. That distinction will become important later, because the public version of Bonnie would become far more violent and theatrical than some witness accounts suggested. But even if Bonnie was not always the one firing, she was not outside the story. She was in the car. She was helping. She stayed. And once people began dying, staying became a choice with weight. The line they could not uncross. The first killing connected to the Barrow gang in this account came during a robbery on April 30, 1932, when a store owner was killed. His wife identified Clyde from photographs provided by police. But by the time the identification mattered, Clyde had already disappeared down the road. That becomes the rhythm. Crime. Identification. Escape. Another car. Another state. Another jurisdiction. Another delay. A few months later, on August 5, Clyde, Raymond, and others attended a country dance in Oklahoma. They were dressed sharply, laughing, standing out. Local law enforcement noticed them. The officers did not even seem to understand who they were dealing with at first. They thought they might be bootleggers. A routine check. That was all. But the Barrow gang misread the approach as exposure. Shots were fired. The local sheriff was hit multiple times but survived. A deputy sheriff died. That was a major line. Killing a civilian in a robbery was already grave. Killing a law enforcement officer changed the hunt. It also changed the way Clyde's name traveled. The gang moved through Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Missouri, and beyond, taking advantage of poor communication between police departments. They did not need to defeat the entire system at once. They only needed to stay ahead of whichever small piece of the system was closest. That was Clyde's gift, motion. He could steal a car, use it, abandon it, steal another, and keep going before the machinery of law fully turned in his direction. But inside the gang, the story was already unstable. Raymond did not stay loyal. He disliked the division of stolen money and left after taking his share. Before leaving, he dismissed Clyde's obsession with attacking the prison. Why should he care about inmates being abused? That line becomes almost ironic later. Because Raymond himself was soon arrested on charges including car theft, robbery, and murder, sentenced to 266 years, and sent to Eastham Prison Farm. The place he had said was not his problem became his cage. Clyde needed new people. One of them was W.D. Jones, a 16-year-old friend from his neighborhood. A few persuasive words from Clyde were enough to pull the boy into the orbit of the gang. For Jones, traveling with this already notorious couple must have seemed exciting at first. A dangerous adventure. A place in a legend before he understood what legends cost. He understood it soon enough. Around Christmas of 1932, Jones and Clyde were stealing a car when the owner caught them. A struggle broke out. The owner grabbed Clyde by the throat and would not let go. Clyde warned him more than once, according to the file, then shot and killed him. Jones was shaken. But by then, he was already inside the moving machine. Running away from it was not simple. During another escape, the gang blundered into a police trap meant for someone else. In the confusion, Clyde killed a Dallas deputy sheriff. By this point, the number of deaths tied to the gang had grown to 5. Now pause there for a second. Because if you are only watching the public image, you might see Bonnie and Clyde as a stylish outlaw couple. But if you follow the file from incident to incident, the image becomes much harder to romanticize. A store owner. A deputy. A car owner. Another deputy. The crimes were not symbolic gestures against banks. They were real violence with real people on the other side. And yet, somehow, when the public finally saw Bonnie and Clyde clearly, many people did not see the dead first. They saw the photographs. That happened because of Joplin. The house they left behind. By March 1933, Clyde's brother Buck and Buck's wife Blanche had joined the group. They rented a temporary place on Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri. The neighborhood was quiet. The Barrow gang was not. They slept during the day, drank at night, played cards, kept guns and ammunition around the rooms, and left beer bottles piling up. One day, Clyde accidentally fired a gun while cleaning it. The noise angered neighbors and drew police attention. This is one of those moments where the case almost feels like it could have changed with a smaller decision. If the gun had not gone off, maybe police would not have come that day. If neighbors had ignored the sound, maybe the gang would have moved before anyone identified them. But they did not. On April 13th, 5 officers arrived, thinking they were investigating bootleggers. They were not prepared for the firepower inside. The gang thought they had been discovered. They opened fire. 2 officers were killed. Jones was badly wounded. Buck was grazed. Clyde was almost untouched. One bullet that should have struck him was stopped by a button on his suit jacket. That detail sounds almost fictional, but in the file it functions as another piece of Clyde's strange luck. Again and again, he survived moments that should have ended him. The gang escaped, but in the rush, they left behind a large amount of property. Buck's parole papers. Weapons. Bonnie's poems. A camera with undeveloped film. This is the hinge. This is the moment where evidence becomes theater. Police developed the film and found photographs that showed the gang in ways the public had never seen. Bonnie with a cigar and a rifle. Clyde in a suit, hair neat, looking strangely refined. The couple posing together. Sometimes affectionate. Sometimes joking with guns. They looked reckless, stylish, young, intimate. Not hidden. Not ashamed. Almost as if they were making souvenirs for themselves. The newspapers understood immediately what those pictures could do. This was no longer just a report about robberies, stolen cars, and killings. It had faces now. It had romance. It had a woman with a gun. It had poetry. It had the kind of contradiction people could not look away from. Cold-blooded killers, said one version. Star-crossed rebels, suggested another. Deadly lovers. Outlaws against a broken system. Grassroots heroes to some people who were already angry at banks, government, police, and the institutions that had failed them during the Great Depression. And that is where the case becomes uncomfortable. Because the facts did not change when the photos were published. People were still dead. The gang was still violent. But the emotional frame changed. The same public that should have seen evidence of danger also saw a fantasy of freedom. A couple refusing to live by the rules in a country where many people felt the rules had already betrayed them. The file even notes that some unsolved crimes committed by others were later blamed on Bonnie and Clyde by the media. That tells us something important. Once a legend becomes useful, it starts absorbing things. It grows bigger than the record. It becomes easier to print the myth than to untangle the truth. And the myth made the gang more famous. But fame did not make them safer. It made every mistake more dangerous. The car becomes a cage. The public saw the romance. Inside the gang, the reality was cramped, exhausted, and unstable. 5 people were living on the road, often packed into a single car, sleeping badly, arguing constantly, hunted by police, and trying to stay ahead of informants, witnesses, newspapers, and bad luck. Fear grows in small spaces. So does resentment. By late April 1933, W.D. Jones had already left for a while after an argument, only returning in June. He came back just before a disaster. Near Wellington, Texas, the gang was driving across a bridge under construction. The driver missed warning signs. The car crashed. Bonnie was trapped long enough to suffer severe burns to her right leg. The file describes the injury as terrible, from hip to ankle, with skin and muscle badly damaged. We do not need to dwell on the physical detail. What matters for the investigation is what it forced the gang to do. Bonnie could no longer move easily. She needed treatment. Medicine. Rest. Help. That made a group built on constant motion suddenly vulnerable. Clyde took risks to keep her alive. The gang kidnapped 2 police officers, took their vehicle and medicine, and managed to keep Bonnie alive. By mid-June, they hid near Fort Smith, Arkansas, in a remote tourist cabin. But injuries create needs. Needs create patterns. Patterns create witnesses. On June 26, Buck and Jones went out for supplies or robbery and were discovered by police. A shootout followed, and another officer was killed. The gang kept moving. By mid-July, they reached the Red Crown Tourist Court in Missouri. This location was almost perfect for fugitives, 2 brick cabins connected by garages, placed between 2 highways, giving quick access to escape routes. But perfect escape planning can still fail if ordinary people notice ordinary things. And the manager noticed. Blanche registered only 3 guests. But the manager saw 5 people get out of the car. The car was backed into the garage, ready to leave quickly. The windows were covered with newspapers. Blanche paid with coins rather than paper money. Her clothing looked out of place compared with local women. Some of the people in the group looked like photographs printed in recent newspapers. That is not one clue. That is a cluster. 1 odd detail might be nothing. 5 odd details start to feel like a pattern. The manager contacted police. Clyde and Jones, meanwhile, went into town to buy supplies for Bonnie. Police had already warned local residents to report strangers buying medical items. A drugstore owner did exactly that. Now 2 lines of suspicion converged, the strange guests at the tourist court, and the strangers buying medical supplies. Police concluded they were looking at the Barrow Gang. Late that night, around 11, officers surrounded the Red Crown Tourist Court. They came with Thompson submachine guns and even an armored car. Police called for the people inside to come out for questioning. Blanche answered from inside, asking for time because the women needed to get dressed. But Clyde was already reaching for a gun. The gunfire began almost immediately. Here the file gives us one of the clearest examples of why the gang kept surviving. The police had serious weapons, but Clyde had stolen Browning automatic rifles from a National Guard armory. Those rifles gave the gang overwhelming firepower. During the chaos, they escaped in their modified Ford. Police shot out the rear window and hit a tire, but Clyde still managed to drive out at more than 70 miles per hour, using speed, skill, and a planned route. They escaped again. But this time escape did not feel like victory. Buck had been badly wounded in the head. Blanche's eyes were injured by flying glass, and she would lose sight in one eye. Bonnie was still suffering from the burn injury. The gang's physical condition was collapsing. They could still run, but now every mile cost more. A few days later, the injuries forced them to stop in Dexfield Park, Iowa. Locals noticed the suspicious group, the bandages, the hiding. Police came. Another gunfight broke out. Clyde, Bonnie, and Jones escaped. Buck and Blanche could not. Buck was captured and died in a hospital 3 days later. Blanche was arrested and later charged. When police searched the park and the Red Crown location, they found modified Browning automatic rifles. Some had shortened barrels and altered stocks. Some had been crudely fitted with multiple magazines so they could fire enormous bursts of ammunition quickly. The weapons were powerful, unstable, and dangerous even to the people using them. The file says that the fact the gang survived so many gunfights with such weapons was almost a miracle. But the miracle was wearing thin. And the next person to break away would do more damage to Bonnie and Clyde than another bullet. The boy who knew too much. W.D. Jones had been pulled into the gang as a teenager. For a while, he lived inside the fantasy that young men sometimes mistake for courage. Cars, guns, notoriety, a famous couple, movement, danger. But after months of running, gunfights, injuries, and death closing in from every direction, the fantasy was gone. Roughly 6 weeks after escaping Dexfield Park, Jones left the gang. He took buses back toward Texas and tried to disappear into the ordinary world, picking cotton near Houston. He was recognized. He was reported. He was arrested. This could have been just another arrest. It was not. Jones had lived inside the car, inside the cabins, inside the arguments, inside the daily habits of Bonnie and Clyde. And when he was handed over to Dallas Deputy Sheriff Ted, the case gained something it had never fully had before, an insider's view. Ted himself had an eerie connection to the story. Before becoming a deputy sheriff, he had been a mailman who often visited the cafe where Bonnie worked. He knew her as a young woman behind a counter, not as the outlaw figure in the newspapers. Now he was helping hunt her. That kind of detail is easy to miss, but it gives the case a strange circular feeling. People from ordinary life kept reappearing inside the criminal file, as if the past kept trying to identify the fugitives hiding under the legend. Jones claimed he had been forced into the gang and wanted mercy. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was strategy. What matters is what he gave police. He described Clyde as quiet, alert, disciplined, and careful. Not a drunken maniac. Not reckless in the way newspapers sometimes suggested. Clyde did not drink heavily, did not gamble, did not use drugs. He avoided staying in one place. He did not use the same car for more than a week. Routes, supplies, timing, exits, Clyde controlled it all. He did not kill for pleasure, at least in Jones's description. But Clyde believed freedom mattered above everything. If killing was the price of staying free, he would pay it without hesitation. That is chilling in a different way. It is not chaos. It is a cold principle. Jones also described Bonnie differently from her newspaper image. According to him, Bonnie had not truly fired in the gunfights. She loaded guns, helped with ammunition, covered, supported, and stayed close to Clyde. She was not innocent. She was not outside the crimes. But the image of Bonnie as the laughing, cigar-smoking, trigger-happy killer may have been partly built by photographs, fear, and newspapers hungry for a female villain. And this becomes one of the central tensions of the case. Was Bonnie Parker the person the public imagined? Or did the public need her to become that person because the story sold better that way? Ted listened to Jones and saw another pattern. Bonnie and Clyde were emotional people. Family mattered to them. They might avoid police, abandon cars, cross states, and change plans constantly, but they still returned toward familiar faces. They still risked contact with loved ones. That gave police a possible opening. On November 22, 1933, officers set up an ambush at a picnic spot often used by the Barrow family, expecting Bonnie and Clyde might appear for a family birthday gathering. They did appear, or at least came near enough for police to spot them. But Clyde's caution and driving skill saved them again. He detected danger and escaped. A few days later, a Dallas grand jury indicted Bonnie and Clyde on murder charges. You might think that would force them to slow down, to hide more carefully, to cut every connection, to reduce risk. But the file takes a sharper turn here, because Clyde's old obsession was still alive. Eastham Prison Farm had never left him. And now someone inside Eastham wanted out. The prison comes back. Remember Raymond, the gang member who had once dismissed Clyde's concern for abused prisoners? He was now inside Eastham himself. According to the file, after experiencing hard labor and mistreatment, Raymond secretly reached out through a released prisoner and his brother. He wanted Clyde's help. A prison break began to take shape. The plan involved Raymond and another inmate, Palmer. A trusted prisoner with the ability to move around inside the prison helped retrieve a gun Clyde had hidden in a drainage ditch. The day before the escape, that prisoner got the weapon and delivered it to Palmer. But prison plans do not stay clean for long. 2 other inmates heard about it and demanded to join. On the morning of January 16, 1934, the escape began. Raymond deliberately left his work group and moved toward Palmer's group. A guard noticed. When he approached to check what was happening, Palmer fired. Clyde was waiting nearby, hidden around a creek, using an automatic rifle to fire into the air and force guards and prisoners down. Bonnie sat in the car, honking the horn as the signal to move. Palmer, Raymond, Henry, and another inmate ran for the car and escaped. This was the Eastham breakout. For Clyde, it may have felt like revenge. For the state, it was humiliation. For the public, it changed the story. That is the twist. Up to this point, some people could still force Bonnie and Clyde into a romantic frame, desperate young lovers, poor kids pushing back against a broken system, bank robbers in a time when banks were hated. But Eastham made the danger harder to ignore. The people freed were not harmless victims. They were serious criminals. One wounded guard later died. The escape did not look like rebellion anymore. It looked like a direct threat to ordinary people. Public sympathy began to collapse. The same newspapers that had turned Bonnie and Clyde into deadly lovers now had a new frame. They were not folk heroes. They were a menace. Texas officials responded by turning to a former Texas Ranger captain named Frank. The file describes him as a legendary lawman, credited officially with killing dozens of criminals and carrying many scars himself. Tall, powerful, quiet, and deeply experienced, he represented an older kind of law enforcement, patient, relentless, comfortable with violence, and not easily shaken. He accepted the mission to hunt Bonnie and Clyde. That is where the shape of the case changes again. Before Frank, many police encounters with the gang were reactive. A suspicious cabin. A reported car. A routine stop gone wrong. Frank approached the hunt like a long calculation. He did not need to chase every rumor. He needed to understand the people around Bonnie and Clyde. Their routes. Their loyalties. Their weaknesses. Their need for contact. Their betrayals. And the gang was giving him material to work with. More people now meant more pressure, not more safety. Fear, greed, exhaustion, and suspicion ate at the group. A bad robbery deepened the cracks. Clyde eventually stole a car and returned toward Dallas with Bonnie and Henry, while Raymond and Palmer went separate ways. The once growing gang began to break apart. And then came a killing that may have destroyed the last pieces of public sympathy. The laughing woman who may not have laughed. On the morning of April 1, 1934, Clyde stopped near a road in Texas after days of exhausting travel. He planned to rest with Bonnie while Henry kept watch. 2 highway patrolmen, Edward and Murphy, noticed the parked car and came closer. Clyde saw them approaching. According to the file, he told Bonnie and Henry, in a low voice, that they should take them. His intended meaning may have been to capture the officers, control the situation, and escape. But Henry misunderstood. Or at least that is the version in the file. He took the words as a signal to attack. He raised his gun. The two young patrolmen were killed. That would have been bad enough. But the story that followed was even more powerful than the facts. A supposed witness told newspapers that Bonnie had planned the attack, and that she laughed while one of the officers was dying. Police also found a cigar but at the scene with small teeth marks, and it was treated as evidence that Bonnie had been there. But the file makes something clear: by this point, not many people cared whether every detail was true. The newspapers had a version of Bonnie that the public was ready to hate. And the image fit too well. The woman with the cigar. The woman with the gun. The woman who laughed. Maybe she did. Maybe she did not. The file does not prove that she did. And that uncertainty matters. Because this is how a legend turns dark. The same theatrical image that once made Bonnie fascinating now made her monstrous. A photograph that helped create glamour could also support hatred. The public did not need to see Bonnie as complicated anymore. They needed her to be the face of the crime. Murphy's fiancée appeared at his funeral wearing her wedding dress. That image appeared in newspapers and detonated public anger. A young officer dead. A wedding that would never happen. A woman in mourning dressed for a life that had just been taken from her. There was no romance left in the outlaw story after that. Not for most people. Texas officers offered reward money for Bonnie's capture. The governor added more. And only 5 days later, Clyde and Henry killed another officer near Commerce, Oklahoma, an older lawman around 60 years old. The file states that by this stage, the gang had committed 12 killings from February 1932 to May 1934, 9 of them law enforcement officers. The charges and accusations around them included robbery, car theft, prison escape, assaulting officers, and murder. Whatever sympathy remained was drowning now. Frank and his 6-man posse kept working. And the final opening did not come from a heroic roadside chase. It came from a human weakness the file had been showing all along: someone close to the fugitives was willing to trade them. Henry Methvin, under pressure, agreed to betray Bonnie and Clyde in exchange for leniency. The plan was simple enough to feel almost inevitable. Henry would separate from them and arrange to meet again near his parents' home. Frank's men would hide along the road, near Highway 154, and wait for the car. There is something very cold about that setup. No warning. No speech. No courtroom. Just patience. A road. Men with guns. And a couple who had survived so many close calls that perhaps part of them believed they would survive this one too. The roadside. By May 23, 1934, Frank's team had been waiting in silence for 2 days. Around 9:10 in the morning, they heard an engine coming closer. The file says they understood the sound before they even saw the car. A vehicle moving that fast down a rural road could only be Clyde. The Ford approached. The officers confirmed who was inside. They raised their weapons and shouted for the car to stop. Clyde did not slow down. He reached for the gun on his lap. The posse believed he was about to fight his way out, as he had done before. 6 men opened fire. They kept firing until they had emptied the ammunition they carried for the attack. The noise was so intense that several of them were temporarily deafened. The Ford lost control and went into the ditch. When the officers approached, they already knew no one could have survived that much gunfire. Bonnie was 23. Clyde was 25. The file describes the scene as brutal, but we do not need to linger on the bodies to understand the meaning of it. The numbers say enough. Around 130 shots fired. The Ford marked with 112 bullet holes. Inside, officers found a small arsenal: Browning automatic rifles, a shortened shotgun, revolvers, automatic pistols, about 100 machine gun magazines, nearly 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and 15 sets of license plates from different states. They also found magazines, detective fiction, romance stories, and poetry books. That inventory may be the most honest portrait of Bonnie and Clyde in the whole file. Not the newspaper image. Not the posed photographs. Not the funeral crowds. A car full of weapons and escape tools, mixed with romantic stories and poems. Violence and fantasy packed into the same moving room. The outlaw myth and the criminal reality sitting side by side, impossible to separate neatly. But death did not end the spectacle. It expanded it. News spread fast. People poured into the area from all directions. The two officers left guarding the scene could not control the crowd. People grabbed for souvenirs. Shell casings. Pieces of clothing. Locks of Bonnie's hair. Some even tried to take parts of Clyde's body. Police had to move the car and bodies to a funeral home in Arcadia. The small town had a population of about 2,000. Within hours, according to the file, it swelled to around 12,000. People came by horse, car, train, even plane, all wanting to see the famous dead outlaws. Sandwiches sold out. Beer prices rose. It was not just a crime scene anymore. It was a public event. A grotesque festival of curiosity. And there is one detail here that feels almost too strange, but it belongs in the file. A funeral home worker named Darby, who had once been kidnapped by the gang, came to help identify or handle the bodies. During that earlier kidnapping, Bonnie had learned he worked in the funeral business and joked that maybe one day he would handle her body. Now he was there, doing exactly that. That is the kind of detail that makes a case feel haunted. Not supernatural. Just circular. As if the story had been leaving its own ending in plain sight. The autopsy counted 17 bullet wounds in Clyde and 26 in Bonnie. The bodies were difficult to prepare because of the damage. When the funeral home doors closed again, the crowd finally began to thin. The chase was over. But the business of turning death into memory had only begun. What the public wanted to keep. Clyde was buried quietly in Dallas. Bonnie's funeral drew enormous crowds, reportedly more than 20,000 people. Her family had trouble even reaching the grave. Flowers arrived from everywhere. One of the largest arrangements came from newspaper vendors, because the deaths of Bonnie and Clyde caused an explosion in newspaper sales. In Dallas alone, papers sold about 500,000 copies. That detail is worth sitting with. 2 criminals die. The public gathers. Newspapers profit. The myth grows. The same media machine that printed their glamour printed their damnation, and then profited from their bodies. People had expected Bonnie and Clyde to be buried together, but Bonnie's family refused. She had written about wanting to go home, but the crowd made it impossible for her family to move her body right away. Years later, in 1945, Bonnie's remains were moved to Crown Hill Cemetery in Dallas. Even in death, the image of the inseparable lovers did not fully match the reality of the families left behind. The promised rewards also shrank. The Dallas sheriff had reportedly said the 6 officers involved could split rewards totaling as much as $26,000. Many people who had promised money failed to pay. In the end, each officer received only about $200. As compensation, they were allowed to take some of Bonnie and Clyde's guns and personal belongings. And the car, the Ford with its bullet holes, became something else entirely. Returned to its owner, it became a traveling attraction. It moved through fairs, amusement parks, flea markets, and exhibitions for decades. People paid to stare at the object where Bonnie and Clyde died. In 1988, a casino near Las Vegas bought it for around $250,000. According to the file, as of 2024, the car and Clyde's death shirt were still displayed behind glass. That might be the final form of the evidence. Not hidden in a police archive. Not buried with the dead. Displayed. Monetized. Looked at. A relic of a story people still cannot stop revisiting. The people around Bonnie and Clyde did not escape the case either. A 1935 harboring trial led to the arrest and trial of 20 people accused of helping, hiding, or encouraging them. Their mothers served short jail terms. Other defendants received sentences ranging from years in prison to symbolic detention. Blanche served part of a 10-year sentence and was released in 1939 for good behavior. She returned to Dallas, cared for her father, and lived until 1988. W.D. Jones received 15 years for murder, survived the law, but not fate. In 1974, he was killed after trying to help a woman and being misunderstood by her boyfriend. Raymond and Palmer were eventually captured and executed in Texas in 1935. Henry, the man whose cooperation helped set the final trap, received a lighter sentence and was paroled in 1942. His later life ended strangely. His father died in a car accident in 1946. Henry himself died in 1948 after lying drunk on railroad tracks and being struck by a train. Some people later wondered whether it was really an accident, or whether betrayal had finally caught up with him. The file does not prove revenge. It simply leaves the suspicion there. And Roy, Bonnie's husband, because legally, she had never divorced him, was killed by police in 1937 while trying to escape prison. Bonnie had died still wearing the wedding ring from that earlier life. Almost nobody truly stepped away from the storm. They were all carried by it in different directions. Some to prison. Some to execution. Some to strange deaths years later. Some to display cases. Some into movies, songs, books, and memory. The legend and the record. Over time, Bonnie and Clyde stopped being only names in a criminal file. They became symbols of the Great Depression. Symbols can be dangerous because they simplify. To some people, they represented desperation in a broken age. To others, they were proof that romanticizing criminals can blind a society to victims. The 1967 film turned them into icons of rebellious cinema, even if the story was heavily dramatized. Decades later, another retelling shifted attention toward the men hunting them, trying to bring the focus back to law, responsibility, and the violence that had to be stopped. But the real file is harder than either version. It does not let Bonnie and Clyde become only lovers. It does not let them become only monsters either. It shows two poor young people shaped by broken homes, bad choices, violence, prison abuse, obsession, loyalty, and fame. It shows a justice system that was slow, fragmented, and sometimes brutal. It shows newspapers that could turn evidence into mythology. It shows a public that wanted villains and heroes, sometimes at the same time. And this is why the role of film matters so much. The strongest evidence in the case did not just help police identify them. It helped the world imagine them. Those photographs gave the public something to project onto. Bonnie with a cigar. Clyde in a suit. A woman with a gun. A couple in love. A joke between fugitives. A performance made for themselves that became a national image. But if you strip away the poses, what remains? A medicine bottle in a stolen car. A prison farm. Two missing toes. A dead store owner. A deputy killed at a dance. A teenager pulled into a gang. A house full of weapons and beer bottles. A camera left behind in panic. A burned leg that forced medical purchases. A tourist court manager who noticed too many people, too many newspapers on windows, a car backed in for escape. A boy who talked after he was caught. A prison break that turns sympathy into fear. A false or unproven story about Bonnie laughing that people were ready to believe. A betrayed meeting near a family home. A Ford with 112 holes. A crowd stealing souvenirs from the dead. That is the real shape of the case. Not one clean legend. A chain of small details, each one pushing the story closer to the end. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable part. Bonnie and Clyde became famous because people wanted their story to mean something bigger. Love against the world. Freedom against authority. Youth against poverty. But the evidence keeps pulling us back to something colder. The people who died were not symbols. The officers, store owners, witnesses, families, and bystanders were not supporting characters in a romance. They were the cost of a myth that became easier to sell than the truth. So when we look back at Bonnie and Clyde, the question is not whether they were legends. They were. The question is what kind of legend they became, and who helped build it. Because a stolen car can be abandoned. A gun can be recovered. A body can be buried. But an image is harder to kill. And in this case, the image began with a roll of film left behind in a room the fugitives were too desperate to clean.